I'd just like to introduce John Vander Doelen. And I will move it so I've got the right place here. So, John is currently the Director of the Occupational Health and Safety System Review Implementation Secretariat. So that's a longer title than most people I know. So in that capacity, he's responsible for providing policy, operational, and administrative support to the implementation of the Expert Advisory Panel report submitted to the Ministry of Labour. And so, as you all know, health and safety system is in a little flux right now, and so John is in the middle of that. So prior to that, John was Director of the Health and Safety Policy and Program Development Branch here in the Ministry of Labour. So in that, he was responsible for the development of occupational health and safety legislation, regulations, and program design, as well as workplace safety insurance legislation. And he held that position for 11 years. And John's also worked in the operations division for over 20 years in head office, as well as regional field offices in occupational health and safety, field enforcement work, as well as operational policy. So, welcome, John, and I look forward to hearing.
Thanks, Richard, and good afternoon to you. I have I think an interesting opportunity to maybe launch you, as Richard has said, into this phase of you undertaking the work for the afternoon. As Richard indicated, we're at what I would describe a very exciting time for occupational health and safety in Ontario, some of which involves specifically implementing recommendations of the expert panel report, which many of the recommendations resonated for me in the context of the presentations we heard from our speakers this morning, in terms of greater support for workplace parties, whether it's in the form of formal or specific guidance material and codes of practice, or whether it's the roles of Ministry of Labour inspectors or Health and Safety Association staff in terms of specifically around the issue of manual materials handling. So there's a specific activity this afternoon to pick your brains in terms of individually and collectively around some of the things that Ontario needs to consider to do in the context of improving specifically MSDs in the context of manual materials handling. But I think in terms of getting that advice from you, what I wanted to do, and you've heard a significant perspective of what's happening in some other jurisdictions, so I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes to just revisit history in terms of what Ontario's history on MSDs and some of the current programs, to allow you then to have that as a reference point for comparison, and then to try and summarize very briefly some of the major themes we heard from the presenters, and then it's over to yourselves. So just as with the other jurisdictions, Ontario struggles with how to reduce lost time injuries around MSDs and material handling. In Ontario, we don't have a specific regulation. We do have general duty clauses which require employers to take all reasonable precautions, and you heard of that as being an approach in one jurisdiction. We have regulations that have performance requirements. So, for example, in our industrial regulations, material handling section that requires that all articles, materials, or things required to be moved shall be moved in a manner which does not endanger the health and safety of the worker. I'm paraphrasing some of the language, but in essence, that's the hook by which the ministry can start to look at, and in the case of where there are extremes, required changes. Ontario's history in terms of some of the specifics of dealing with ergonomics issues was triggered by a minister at the time appointing a Labour and Employer Stakeholder Advisory Council, which led to a number of recommendations, some of which you've heard resulted in specific materials. For example, most of you, I think, have seen the MSD guidance material, the toolkits, which contain both the basic ergonomic principles, best practices, some information on risk assessment, but not a lot specifically on manual materials handling and some of the risk assessments associated with that. So when Richard and Dee initially started talking about holding such a forum, I was really excited about the potential for this to keep alive the discussions that started with that advisory panel that not only resulted in these kinds of materials, but resulted in specific things which you heard from some of the other presenters this morning around specific guidance material that both was sector specific or task specific and we've seen the development of that along some of the safety associations and those sectors. Specific initiatives to train health and safety inspectors in the issue of ergonomics generally and materials handling, and how that's an important element to support the efforts both of the workplace parties, but also in terms of enforcement and compliance, and some of the training that's occurred in the ministry with our own inspectors. The specific issues of taking initiatives around targeting and priority, and you heard from Sophie this morning in terms of some of the blitzes and the number of orders that have been issued by our inspectors and our ergonomists in terms of specific blitzes. Anne could give you more detail, but my understanding is that in a couple of those blitzes, the number of orders border on thousands for requiring specific changes. So we're quite active as well. I think today we want to start the conversation, continue the conversation in terms of how Ontario moves forward to enhance what we have done, building on what other jurisdictions have in terms of their experience. What I'd like to do then, just before sort of handing it over to you, is to sort of summarize what we heard from some of the presenters this morning in terms of some of the key elements. So in younger days, I probably would have been able to synthesize it all and sort of give you a complete picture, but now I'm left to just sort of go chronologically through what we heard, so bear with me here. So we heard from many of the speakers that there's different processes for developing regulations, engagement of stakeholders early on, or very much a closed process and government bringing it forward for ultimate, I was going to say consultation, but in some instances we heard confrontation, which I've made sausages too, Ed, and it's not a pretty picture, I agree. We've heard that all the jurisdictions basically have seen a reduction in MSDs with their efforts, but that in many instances the reduction in MSDs tends to mirror the overall reduction in lost time injuries. So what's the source of those reductions? Can we put a lot of confidence in education awareness? Can we put a lot of confidence in regulation, or the enforcements that might flow specifically from a regulation, or enforcement that might flow from general duty obligations to take all reasonable precautions in the circumstances, or some hybrid in between? All of the jurisdictions have developed tools, whether they're best practices, whether they're risk assessment tools. We heard a lot about the difficulty of landing on one tool as consensus supported either by the science or in practice. Okay, so I think in any sort of risk assessment process, we need an understanding that there is no one perfect or assessment tool, and that very much the principles underlying some of the risks need to be evaluated rather than ending up with a numerical evaluation that you can put 100% confidence in. In terms of regulating, some use, as I said, general duty requirements. Some take specific requirements around hazards, but still address them in a performance way. Okay, risk assessment, do your risk assessment on the basis of risk factors you identify, take precautions in a certain way, or in some instances, efforts to establish specific maximums, as we heard. I've already touched on this a little bit, but I think on a go-forward basis, we're looking very much for your advice, and certainly as the system partners, the Ministry of Labour and the Health and Safety Associations move forward, the development of guidance material that's helpful, both on a sector basis, but also of a more general to create a greater, not only awareness of ergonomics, but keep it real. As we heard earlier on, it's a real challenge to keep this issue in focus in people's minds and workplace parties' minds. It's easy to think they put a program or two in place and they've solved the problem, and 5 years later it's really not much better off than it was prior to some initiatives. Specific approaches can either develop partnerships and a consensus, and other approaches can really polarize individuals, and we heard some of the experiences in terms of regulatory approach where a lot of energy between the state workplace parties, whether it's labor and employers, or labor, employers, and government, have gone into managing the issue as opposed to getting down to dealing with ergonomics and some of the implementation. So I think that we've got to find a way that everyone accepts a role and wants to move forward on this with avoiding the energy that gets lost in a confrontational approach. We heard about how guidance material developed by third-party organizations may be helpful in terms of avoiding biases that creep in, that they're either seen as government set the numbers, or a labor organization or employer organization has set the numbers. So ACJH as a body, for example, as being more of a neutral standard that hopefully people would look to adopt. Tom articulated very well, there's reasons for doing the right thing, but there's a lot of people who are ready to give you the impediments to being able to do that. And I think we have to find solutions that get past the we've always done it this way, or there's no agreement on what the ergonomic solution needs to be. We need to get people to understand the benefits of the reductions and improved jobs, which doesn't land on the I can't do it, don't want to do it approach. And as much as it's important to create guidance material for the workplace parties, labor, employers, all different parts of the organization, we need similar materials for those involved in the health and safety system in Ontario, whether it's the people who provide training and consulting services, and the Ministry of Labour inspectors, Ministry of Labour ergonomists. So we're all looking at whether it's a specific task or more generally hazards across a spectrum of activities in a similar way, so we can land on some constructive discussion of how to approach it. And I think some of what we're looking to you today is to give and provide some input and direction of where the starting point for some of that material and some of that guidance and some of that direction would come. So I'm really looking forward, I would say, to this afternoon's work that you're going to do and the ideas that you're going to generate to help us get further along than we are now, and making the improvements that the numbers in terms of the lost time frequencies and costs and all the other things associated with excessive risk around ergonomics and MSDs would generate, and that you'll help us find the activities for the next number of years in Ontario. Thank you.